How to hold Bronze Age swords. Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria. Now, first up, I want to say that this is essentially an appendix to my previous video talking about Bronze Age swords and how they were maybe used. Now, the first thing I have to say straight off the bat, this is a beautiful replica by Neil Burridge, who is basically the foremost expert on replicating Bronze Age swords and has probably handled more original Bronze Age swords, certainly from Northern Europe, compared to any other expert that I'm aware of. Okay, now the other thing we have to say is that a lot of this is conjectural, so we can draw upon later periods of sword use, we can draw upon anthropological ethnographic studies of other weapons and other fighting systems, but it is all conjectural, number one. Number two is the fact that just because a hilt or a form of sword might promote a certain way of holding it, to me, doesn't mean that another person is going to come to the same conclusion. And that was almost certainly true in period as well. So if we go all the way back to the late Bronze Age, for example, the period of this Limehouse sword here, then it's entirely possible that giving this sword to 10 Bronze Age people in Britain at the time, they wouldn't all hold it in the same way. What you might find is 8 of them might hold it in one way, and the other 2 might hold it in another way, or 8 of them or 7 of them might hold it in one way, and 1 or 2 of the others might have 2 further ways of holding it, which might vary. And this is true of later periods as well. This is true of sabres, which we know obviously a huge amount about, rapiers, medieval longswords, arming swords, so on and so forth. So even if we look at 15th century longswords, there isn't only one way of holding them. There's actually at least 2-3 different ways of holding a longsword. And that would also be true of Viking era swords, and it was certainly true, as I say, of all medieval and Renaissance swords and later period swords. Right, so coming back to the Bronze Age. Now, my proposal, my theory, was that because of these mushroom-shaped or disc-shaped pommels, that probably tells us how most people held these, or how at least the makers intended them to be held. And that is essentially with a form of hammer grip. Now, some people have said to me, oh no, I have seen certain experts who say we should use a handshake grip, or various other names that are attributed to different forms of grip. Now, one of the big differences, if I just pick up, and I used this Viking era sword previously, if I just pick up this, one of the big differences is that while both of these project in this direction, the Viking era swords usually don't project very much in the other direction. So actually, superficially, although there's some similarity in silhouette between the projections of the pommels of these two swords, they're very, very different if we turn them 90 degrees that way. This means that, indeed, with certain other Iron Age swords, Migration era swords, Viking era swords, and indeed later wheel pommels, we can hold the sword in such a way that the pommel can ride past what I call the heel of the hand down here. However, that is not really possible, and I made the parallel with Indian tulwar, which we know a lot about how they were held, because it's shown in photographs and art and described in written text from the British colonial period. When you've got a pommel that projects at the side, we can't really do that handshake grip because the pommel projects at the side. It prevents the heel of the hand, the bottom of the hand here, from riding over the side, because literally it projects equally forwards and backwards and sideways. Now, so therefore that tells us, in my mind, that we can't really use a form of handshake grip. Now, some people have tried to do this by riding the hand up higher. I will talk about this in a second, okay? I'll talk specifically about this in a second. I'll come back to that. And some people even, in my view, cheat with tulwars as well and say, oh, well, you know, the tulwar pommel doesn't force you into holding it with this grip. It just means you have to put one finger up here, and now that pommel isn't a problem anymore. Well, hold on a second. Tulwars and these swords were developed and made specifically to have these types of pommels. Why would you make a disc pommel like that if it wasn't to promote or assist a certain type of gripping? You shouldn't be thinking about this as, how do we get around this problematic pommel? That really hurts my hand when I hold it a certain way, so I'm going to hold it in a really weird way so that my hand doesn't have to interact with the pommel anymore. I'm sorry, inventions and developments of equipment don't work like that. You don't specifically make a pommel a certain shape if it's inherently problematic. You make it another shape that isn't problematic. Now, at that point, I want to come off on a slight tangent, still on Bronze Age swords, and point out that many other Bronze Age swords do not have pommels like that. Okay, so it's entirely possible that, we'll come back to those mushroom or disc pommels in a second, it's entirely possible that other Bronze Age swords, I would argue particularly if they're used from horseback, have other types of pommel. Now this one has got purely a pommel, if we can call it that. It's almost not a pommel, a hand stop, which is the shape of the tang. Now we do know archaeologically that very often there was additional pommels added onto these. So just because the tang is this shape and finishes square at the end there, it doesn't mean that the original sword this was based on, again another lovely Neil Burridge one, it doesn't mean that it didn't have a pommel, because we absolutely know from archaeology that sometimes an additional pommel was then added on the top. Sometimes glued, sometimes pinned, maybe riveted. There were various different ways of attaching them. And in many cases we actually do have other similar swords which have a little projection added on the top of the tang here to add the pommel onto. Moreover, we know there were different shapes of pommel. And we actually know that some of these pommels were actually long and went this way, but were thin this way. So in that sense, some of them are a little bit like the bars we find, because this lower portion of the pommel originally was a bar on Migration era swords, and then they add this top bit on later as a cap on the Viking era swords. But we know that some of the Bronze Age pommels were functionally almost identical to Migration era and Viking era swords. So they could be wide in this plane, narrow in this plane. And in those cases, in the cases where we've got those wide but narrow pommels, caps if you want to call them that, or indeed no pommel at all, then indeed you can basically hold this one in a handshake grip because there's nothing in the way to prevent it. But coming back to the mushroom or round pommel, bearing in mind that those other pommels or lack of pommels existed in the Bronze Age, why would some of these have specifically this type of side projecting pommel as well as front on projecting pommel if it wasn't to promote or encourage or assist some type of gripping? Right. Okay, so I'm going to draw a line under that. My firm belief is that as an archaeologist, as a sword user, as someone who does fencing twice a week, you don't get a specific size and shape of pommel like that unless it ties into the way that you grip the sword. And you shouldn't have to work around the pommel. The pommel should fit with that way of gripping the sword because that's how most people grip the sword, so that's why they make the pommels like that in this case. And incidentally, you might be thinking archaeologically, how do these wooden pommels survive? Well, luckily some of these were made of bronze, so we actually have examples. In fact, I've got a picture on a book here which actually shows one where you can actually see a bronze version of this pommel. So this is made in wood, but it's modelled on the bronze pommel, which is found archaeologically. So we absolutely know they existed in that size and shape. Right, so now onto, I mentioned the finger. So I have noticed a number of people mentioning about fingering the guard in a Bronze Age sword context. Now you will notice that this particular Limehouse sword, the edge comes all the way down to here, and then you have these shoulders. Now some people who don't like accepting that this is going to force you to use a hammer grip like that, some people have said, oh well, I want to have a little bit more mobility in the wrist. They push the hand upwards and they put a finger over there. And what that instantly does is we talk about fingering the guard famously with rapiers and things like that, but even earlier with side swords and late period arming swords, is it means that it changes the angle between the blade and your forearm from this to this, which means that you can reach further and thrust more easily. And yes, indeed, if we just put the finger out here, so I've only now got 3 fingers around the grip essentially, yes, I've now got easier and greater rotation with the wrist, but it makes that style of pommel completely redundant and pointless. Like, why would you make that style of pommel if you were going to do that? That's the first question, which I've already addressed. But secondly, we have a mechanical problem here. So that might look to you like a nice place to rest your finger. 2 problems. Number one, it makes the finger very vulnerable. I don't think that's necessarily a big point of contention, because ultimately all your fingers are vulnerable with these types of swords. They don't really have big handguards. They don't even, you know, if you look at a later Iron Age Xephos, for example, from Greece, they have proper crossguards like a medieval sword does, but these don't. But it doesn't really matter, because the same was for everyone. This is a large machete-like object, which you just accept it doesn't have hand protection, and you're using a shield anyway, so you're not fencing away bum 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 with sword against sword. You're predominantly defending with the shield while going in and attacking with the edged weapon like a big knife. But there is a bigger problem, and that is that the edges of these blades go almost all the way down to the bottom, which means it's really, really tenuous and risky for you to put your finger over here, because any riding up and you're going to be cutting your finger, the edge goes to there. Okay, so I won't say it's edged down here, but it is edged there. Why would you have that edged all the way down there if the sword maker's intention was for you to put the finger over? My argument would be you wouldn't. That's rubbish. The idea is throw that in the bin, throw it out of the window. Okay, it doesn't make sense. However, I know that some of you who know about Bronze Age swords will be saying, but Matt, if we look at, I think, the Wilburton and also this Carp's tongue variety, they have a really interesting design feature. They have a edge that comes down here and then specifically stops with a shoulder and has this little nook here. Now, some people, and I can completely understand why, have argued you would only do that as a placer for the finger, or at the very least, that might be what that is for, and that's why you have that. And certain models of sword have this little nook because it's like a finger placer or finger ring on a later period, like a Renaissance sword. So, I'm not going to say that this is wrong, and I'm not going to say that no one ever did it. I'm sure that someone in history did it, but I don't personally think that is the purpose of those, and I'm going to give you a couple of reasons why. Firstly, I think it makes a nonsense of some of these pommels, because I think these pommels are to encourage, just like with talwars, to encourage and support certain systems of gripping, essentially hammer fisting. And I'll come back to that at the end. Why would you want to hammer fist? But in addition to that, these aren't really big enough. Now, admittedly, Bronze Age people were smaller than me. I'm about 184, so about 6'1", and I'm larger than an average Bronze Age British person, okay? Which probably means that my hands are slightly bigger, and everything else is slightly bigger. But I'm slightly bigger than a Bronze Age person. However, hands don't vary that much in percentage terms. So if my overall size is 10% larger than an average Bronze Age person, that doesn't make an awful lot of difference to my hand, okay? And also, difference of 10% in height doesn't usually equate to 10% difference in hand size. It's usually less than that. Right, so the basic problem here is there's not really enough room for the finger. So while I could put a sort of slanted handshake grip in there and just put the end of my finger around there, the problem is this junction here. Now, you could argue that that's not going to be necessarily sharp all the way down there. I would argue that it probably should be sharp all the way down there. And if it is, that's going to cut your finger. But even if it's not sharpened, you still have this corner here, which when you're moving this sword around and swinging it, is digging in. That little corner is almost even worse than a blunt normal edge, because it digs into the top of your finger. So fundamentally, I just don't believe that these nooks are intended to put your finger over. If you were making them specifically as a finger indexing place, then you would put the edges even further up and give yourself more safety margin, and you wouldn't have that hot spot little corner right there that you're going to keep catching or rubbing your finger against. It's horribly uncomfortable. And really, this actually isn't sharpened, but if that was a fully sharpened edge, you'd be cutting your finger all the time. So I think it doesn't really make sense. That's not to say that some people didn't grip with the finger up, maybe, and use it maybe like this, which there's some evidence of talwars occasionally being used like, and other swords indeed. But wrapping it around, I don't think really makes an awful lot of sense. And equally, I have seen some theories about holding it like this. Now that's interesting. With this pommelless sword, that is actually plausible, and as you can see, I can hold it like that, and that brings it point on line. And it must be said that thrusting was clearly important to these people because they have a specifically designed thinner carp's tongue portion of the blade for thrusting. So, but the fact that it's wider up here suggests they also want to cut with it. So this is a cut and thrust sword. But if they're predominantly thrusting with these, or at least 50% thrusting with these, then holding this sort of grip would make some kind of sense. But here's the problem. Look at where the pommel is. Only because this has no pommel at all is that really possible for me to hold it like that. If the pommel was projecting a lot this direction, then it would really get in the way and be quite uncomfortable. And if it was projecting sideways, like that mushroom-shaped pommel, I couldn't do it at all. So I'm not really convinced they were doing this either. I suspect most of them just held it like that, in the simplest, easiest form of hammer grip. Now, I did promise, and this is the final point I want to make, that I would mention about the hammer grip. So first off, I have to state, some people look at modern Western fencing, some people look at the use of side swords or sword and buckler or long swords or rapiers, and they extrapolate a lot from that and try and apply it to the use of Bronze Age weapons or Roman gladius or Sparta or Viking era weapons. And sometimes they don't match up. These are very different weapon systems. They're using shields. They're made of different materials, and I'll come back to that in a second. But they are very different things. So just because people used a sword and buckler a certain way in the 13th or 14th century doesn't mean that that is how, let's say, a Viking would use a sword and shield in the 9th century. It doesn't necessarily translate. There might be things that you can extrapolate and transfer and modify. There might not be. It might be completely different. Remember, there are other places in the world where they use swords and shields. For example, if we look at sword and shield use in the Sudan, which we actually have old videos of, dervishes, as they're known, but tribal people in the Sudan using swords and bucklers. And it's very, very different to, let's say 133 sword and buckler. Completely different system. Anyway. So coming back to this, why would you want to hold it in a hammer fist grip? Well, the first thing we have to say is that a lot of other systems did grip swords in a hammer fist grip and promoted this right angle, or very close, sometimes a slightly extended, but close to right angle between the forearm and the blade. And the first reason is to slash rather than to chop. So I'll just move back a bit for a second. So if a blade goes like this and extends out from the arm, it is chopping, okay? If you keep it here and you swing from the body and with the arm and pull the blade across the target, you're impacting at this angle, and that is more slicing. So the difference is between hitting the target at 90 degrees or hitting it at something closer to 45 degrees. And those are different kinds of cuts. Now, these stiff wrist, as it's called, stiff wrist cuts, cutting from the elbow and the shoulder, were promoted particularly in India, the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, and it produces a different type of cut. It's a shorter range cut, it doesn't reach as far, but it has some inherent advantages. It creates a longer wound on horseback, it draws across the target instead of stopping on the target, and so on and so forth. We'll talk more about those maybe in a more dedicated video. But we know that historically this was done. So maybe it was done in the Bronze Age. And I would argue this pommel suggests it was, because there's a parallel here between keeping the wrist at that angle or very close to that angle and only allowing a restricted amount of movement here, and hitting at an oblique slanted angle the target so that you chop into it and draw through and free your weapon, okay? Rather than extending out and chopping like that, where you can see the pommel is sticking very uncomfortably into my hand and running a risk of disarming myself. Why might Bronze Age people have wanted to do this with this Limehouse sword? Well, there's a number of reasons. First of all, this is a top-heavy chopping sword, much like an Indian talwar or a Ottoman kilich or a Persian shamshir, all of which were systems where we know they did the stiff wrist and let the weight of the sword and the path of the sword do the work for them. They didn't generally chop out like this with those swords, okay? So it's consistent with other historical sword use methods that are very well documented, firstly. Secondly, the material, okay, and this is the point that I want to finish on. This is made of bronze. Bronze is a very different material to steel, okay? Now, it's possible that these swords were found to be less durable when just swung and mashed into things. And it's possible that, given the nature of the material, they found them more likely to survive combat if they were chopped and drawn across a target and freed and then come in for another chop. So that the cuts, you can see I'm quite close to the camera here, I'm 3 feet away from it, the cuts are drawing across. Now this is exactly the motion that's described being used with kilich, talwar, shamshir. Okay, so we know this is, and to some extent the Polish szabla, we know that this drawing across motion was done with sabres later. And other weapons, things like kora as well, and kanda and things like that. And so this puts the blade under less stress. If we have a blade made of wootz steel or made of bronze perhaps, then the blade is less likely to come under the kinds of stresses which might bend or break it. It's just a theory, it might be wrong. What do you think? So I'd be very interested to hear in the comments underneath what you think about these theories. I personally think that Bronze Age swords, if not all the time and by all people, were predominantly gripped in a hammer fist, particularly these ones with this mushroom type or disc-like pommel, because it's the sensible, it's what makes sense, okay? It's what we find parallels for in other history, and it's what makes sense when you pick these up. Trying to hold them in other ways just doesn't really work very well. Finger over, I suspect, wasn't really done very much in the Bronze Age, if ever, because I don't think the archaeology of the object supports it. And finally, the method of cutting, coming back to that pommel, I think this hammer fist grip is what also makes sense when we consider the types of cuts and thrusting angles around shields, incidentally, makes sense with the use of these Bronze Age swords. What do you think? Do you know Bronze Age swords which might fly in the face of this theory? Because bear in mind, different swords might have different ways of gripping, different systems of use, might be used with different size or type shields. Some might be primarily for use on foot, some on horseback. Very interesting discussions to be had there. Anyway, I'll be interested to see your comments down below. Thanks a lot for watching. As always, I have been Matt Easton. Thanks to Neil Burridge for making amazing swords, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.